I have two terrific panelists who are going to be joining me here, Victoria Samson and Laetitia Zarkan from the UNIDIR. So space has remained important for us for a very long time, but many of us do not realize how dependent we are on space. We just take it for granted that space is going to be there for us. We don't even realize how our day-to-day lives are affected by it, whether it is in terms of your getting directions to come to the conference center here today, or using the ATMs, or using weather forecasting, whole range of functions. We just take it for granted, and we don't even realize how the space is so closely linked to our daily lives. But I think all of this is coming under increasing risk from a variety of activities. Space security threats have grown enormously, whether it is in terms of the growth in the counter-space capabilities, anti-satellite capabilities. Again, both of the colleagues will be talking about these issues, or growth in terms of the number of satellites, so overcrowding, congestion in space, whether it is in the terms of the number of satellites or even the space debris and so on and so forth. You also have mainly the US-China competition, again, spearheading much of the other dynamics that you see in the space security domain in a sense. And there have been several efforts in the past to regulate the activities in outer space, whether it is in terms of a decade ago you had the EU-sponsored, initiated International Code of Conduct for Outer Space Activities, which is in a state of a limbo or a frozen stage. You have had a few other, the Russia-China co-sponsored treaty mechanism called the Prevention of the Placement of Weapons in Outer Space. You have a longer title, but shortly called the PPWT. You also have had a couple of other efforts, but most recently, the current effort that we are looking at is the OEWG, Open-Ended Working Group on Space Security, in terms of how do we develop certain norms, certain principles that would regulate our behavior in space, the state behavior in space. So I think this is the crux of what we are going to be discussing. But let me start off with our panelists in looking at as to why are we talking about space security, why are we talking about the governance, why has it become so important for us? So what are the kind of threats that we are looking at that has become so critical in a sense that we are looking at a number of measures when it comes to the governance aspects? Let me start off with you, Victoria.
Sure, and thank you, Raji. And hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Samson. I'm with the Secure World Foundation. We're a nonprofit based in the United States, and we focus on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. So we promote best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is accessible to and usable for all over the long term. Yeah, thank you, Raji, for the exclamation point. So one of the things that my organization puts together is what we call a global counter space threat assessment. It's available on our website. And so one of the things we look at is the rise of counter space capabilities, and that can be anything from what we call a direct ascent anti-satellite weapon, that is a missile launched on the ground to a satellite in space, to looking at co-orbital threats, so the idea that your interceptor goes into space, gets into orbit, and then approaches a satellite, its target, and either runs into it or interferes with it somehow, to things like directed energy, lasers, usually used to interfere with imaging capabilities, to things like electronic warfare, that is a radio frequency interference or jamming, and then finally cyber attacks. So one of the things we've looked at is that while there's an increase in research and development of counter space capabilities globally, the only counter space capabilities being used in active conflicts are those that are not destructive in nature. That is to say, cyber, which Laetitia knows a ton about, we'll probably be talking about a bunch, and then radio frequency interference jamming. But I mean, there are concerns. There are concerns about the interference, whether or not those capabilities can be there when you depend on them to be there. One of the things that we have noticed just in the 5 years of doing this assessment is that we've doubled the number of countries that we've been following. We went from 6 countries in 2018 to 11 countries this year. We probably will add a few more. And so so what Raji was saying, there's a real proliferation of research development into threat capabilities. There are countries holding anti-satellite tests that cause destructive debris that lasts for a long time. One of the things we have is a lovely table in our document that talks about all the pieces of debris that's been created. And, debris can be incredibly threatening, even if it's small, just because of the high speed it moves at in Earth orbit. And that debris stays around for a while, and it gets kicked off to a bunch of things. One of the things I brought was this lovely ASAT test debris infographic, which is available on our website. But basically, it just demonstrates about how, it's an imperfect world when debris is created, it kicks off all over. It can absolutely threaten other users of space. And so you have that happening at the same time when the discussions at the United Nations have been essentially stalled. Raji mentioned a couple of the efforts. There's been various treaty options gone, but they've gone nowhere. They've had these circular arguments for years. And part of that is the reason that there's just a difference in opinion amongst the major geopolitical superpowers as to what is the biggest threat to space. Is it actual, created weapons that are in space? No one's really working on those. People think of space-based interceptors, something like that. No one's really doing that, but there is a concern. And then people say, okay, we need to have a treaty, a legally binding approach to defend against this type of threat. And then there are others who talk about, actually, so much of space just depends on what you do with it. The same satellite that can be used for intelligence purposes can be used to monitor crop growth. The same satellite that can be used for close approach to help refuel when your satellite runs out of fuel could also be used to interfere with another satellite. So it's not so much the technology, but it's the intent. It's what do you do with that? And so there's been a shift to look at norms of behavior with the idea that, okay, we'll have these actions that are what responsible actors in space do, and we'll try and describe that. And so it's really where I'm cautiously optimistic. Over the past couple of years, we've had these circular arguments for years and years and going nowhere. But this open-ended working group that Raji brought up, and if you want me to go into that, or are you going to talk about the open-ended working group? Okay, I'll stop and let Laetitia talk about that. But I think we have the potential to actually get somewhere. And given that there's such an interest in counter space capabilities, given that so many more countries are doing military space development, given how much, as Raji said, everyone on this planet is a user of space data. And so everyone on this planet has an incentive and a reason to ensure that the space domain is predictable, stable, and not interfered with. I mean, we're at a point where something needs to be done, and hopefully this open-ended working group will have an ability to do that. And with that, I'll stop and let Laetitia take on.
Laetitia, just let me add to that. I think in addition to the whole challenge of more number of actors, diverse set of actors, including private sector, industry players, educational institutions, and so on and so forth. You also have a new range of activities on-orbit satellite servicing technologies that have been developed in order to repair, refuel satellites, and so on and so forth. How are they figuring in the OEWG talks or broadly the global governance talks? Are you likely to see any rules of the road? Because I don't think we have yet begun to have serious discussions on those. So maybe you can just discuss some of that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Raji, for your invitation. So my name is Laetitia Zarkan. I'm working for the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, and I'm focusing on space security and cybersecurity of space systems. So before answering to your question, Raji, I just wanted to go back to the role of this open-ended working group, because it takes place in the premises of the Palais des Nations in Geneva, in Switzerland, and it's in the context of the Conference on Disarmament. So it's a very selected amount of members, but at the same time, the group is open-ended, meaning that it includes not only member states, but also members of the public society, meaning academia, think tanks, foundations, institutes, organizations, as well as the private industry. And this is a point that is extremely important, because it's not only diplomatic discussions, it goes beyond that. It's very much multilateral discussions among the international community. And this is really something that we keep in mind when carrying out the different discussions and the different activities. In the context of this open-ended working group, we are gathering during different sessions. The first one was on existing norms that could apply. So, for instance, there were comparisons between the law of the sea, or the aviation law, and outer space law. Or what are the existing transparency and confidence building measures that apply in other fields and that could be relevant for outer space. Now, we can see during the discussions that it's really a matter of perception of the different member states. And this is exactly what Victoria said, right? We, for instance, in September, gathered to discuss what are the most present and the most threatening issues related to outer space, and we distributed the different sessions between space to space, ground to space, space to ground, ground to ground. What Raji asked about is the space-to-space threats, and for certain groups of countries, it's the most pressing threat. Why? Because we have eyes on the sky, we have observatories, we have telescopes, but at the moment, we don't have accurate, timely, and global, let's say, awareness of every single activity happening in outer space. One of them, for instance, is rendezvous and proximity operation. One of them can be a separation in orbit, so you launch one asset, and it just separates in orbit, and it makes it two assets. One of the main points on the space-to-space threat is dual-purpose assets. So we make this distinction between dual use and dual purpose, dual use being GNSS, for instance, all of the assets that are used by both the military and civilians. For instance, GPS can be used to localize troops. It can also be used for timing of civilian services, or also just for you to drive from a point to another. Now, dual purpose is this type of assets that is launched in order to carry out a very benign and innocent activity, and that can be perceived as a threat because it goes closer without any notification or information to another asset. And this is also something that we try to underline in the group, and I will come back to this a bit later. It's this need to inform and to notify, to be transparent about the activity. So all of these different threats that are perceived by the different states are not so complicated to interpret by the different competitors or the different rivals.
Okay. Terrific. Given that space is truly a global common in a sense, one state's activities is going to affect everybody there. And the state of the affairs with regard to you listed a number of different series of threats that we are faced with today. What are some of the norms, principles, or even best practices that can be useful, or that can be even more importantly, feasible to be developed by states today, given that I think the developing consensus among the states today has become the biggest impediment or biggest challenge in developing an outer space regime. So given that, what are the kind of feasibilities and what are the kind of norms that you would like to see developed? What are the kind of best practices you would like to see states adopt in a sense? Okay, if I can start off with you, Victoria.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest concerns that I have is the deliberate creation of long-lived debris. Because again, I was a political science major, so I'm going to grossly oversimplify this. But the higher up it goes, the longer it's going to be around. And so if you have debris tests being held at higher altitudes, that means it's going to be around for months, years, centuries even, depending how high up it goes. And as of right now, there's no way to get down debris. It's up there until the Earth's gravitational force pulls it back down. There are companies working in countries working on what they call active debris removal, but that is still it's in their early stages, put it that way. Hopefully it'll work out. So my point is, if you deliberately create debris, then it's going to be an issue for all space users. Orbital dynamics are agnostic in terms of who you are. The sheer physics of the space environment means if someone, even if a country that's friendly to you, has a test and creates debris, that is going to affect your satellites up there, whether or not you're a geopolitical rival or not. And so there's been a norm emerging, or a call emerging over the past year. The United States was the first to do this. The idea, the United States made a commitment to commit to not conduct destructive anti-satellite missile tests because of the debris that they create. And the United States called on other countries to do it, and 6 other countries have since joined on this pledge. And so one of the things that I find very encouraging about this is that it's almost establishing a norm, okay, that this is a type of behavior that is so irresponsible and so dangerous to all actors in orbit and all users of space data, which again is everyone on this planet, that it's something that they really want to discourage. And countries, not just the United States, have done it. The United States has tested anti-satellite weapons. The 4 countries to conduct a destructive anti-satellite tests are in order of which they did it, chronological order: the United States, Soviet Union / Russia, China, and India. But other countries have taken this pledge who have not done these tests, and the reason why is, again, because it's considered to be such irresponsible behavior. And so I very much hope that this pledge will show up in the open-ended working group's documents. I know that there is talk of a resolution of the General Assembly to put this pledge into, an action. And then at some point, there's even been discussion about possibly making this a legally binding treaty. Of course, that's years down the road. But one of the important things is how do you get, an understanding as to what's appropriate behavior is you get the international community to come out and talk about it and to say, this is something we see is really inappropriate. So hopefully that'll be one of the things that we'll see come out of this open-ended working group and the discussions. And the other thing that I think is really important is the idea of some sort of incidents at space, the idea that, Laetitia brought up close approaches, and that's one of the real concerns. I mean, we don't have a very good sense of what's happening in orbit, and so if you have another country's satellite do an uncoordinated close approach to yours, I mean, that can be a little discombobulating because you don't know what their intentions are. You don't know if they're there just to spy on your satellite. You don't know if they're going to try and intercept communications. You don't know if they're going to possibly try to kinetically interfere with your satellite. And so, and again, there's not much you can do about this issue. There's no traffic cop for space. They're just actors doing their thing and hopefully coordinating at some point. And so the idea is that, it's important to have some sort of agreed upon behaviors from military satellites to say, okay, you agree not to get too close, you agree to coordinate close approaches, along those lines, and those can be very helpful, again, in establishing a predictable, stable, and reliable space environment, so you don't have to worry about, exquisite military satellites being interfered with, which can be extremely escalatory. And when I say escalatory, it means it could actually lead to conflict on Earth. What do you think, Laetitia?
I fully agree with your approach on this, and I will add also with regard to debris that we can see that every single mistake or omission or even disruption created in outer space by one individual has collective consequences. And that's the most complicated issue because it's not only state against state, it's not only individual against state, it's every single space operator that has this responsibility. Now, with regards to how the negotiations are led, indeed, you have different approaches. And last year, I was very lucky to write a piece for the ORF, for the digital debates. And I tried to unfold a bit the different processes. And I would say that it did not really change, meaning that you will have some big initiatives taken by different states. For instance, the United States that commit not to conduct ASAT tests or development of technology, and you will have other states that are engaging in extremely long process. Raji mentioned at the beginning the PPWT. This is the type of draft treaty that is taking care of a very pressing point for the states that are part of it, and they are trying to gather as much person as possible, as many states as possible. So that's two different approaches. One is leading by example somehow, and trying to show the way in a very leadership position, as the United States tends to also conduct their foreign policy, and others are also trying to see on a different multilateral discussions. But perhaps it's more details in the article now. I have not a limited time to describe this. But to answer Raji's question about the norms, I would say that it depends also on what is considered as a pressing threat, as I just mentioned. So we can see that for the United States is the threat from the ground to space, so ASAT missiles, direct ascent one. For countries like the Russian Federation or China with the PPWT, it will be the placement of weapons in outer space, and there are a lot of discussions ongoing on both of these points. And then, for instance, in May, France made a declaration on the fact that the consequences are what matters. So the damage created, the disruption created, the effect is more important, so it can adapt to the development of technology. And that's also an interesting approach that is taken because it also tries to not get focused on one threat, but to encompass them all. But same, it's being criticized as well. So there are constant discussions on this, and this is also the role of the open-ended working group. It's to take all of the different perspectives and to discuss and to improve altogether our views. Now, with regards to the norms, we can see that attribution can be complicated, and that's the thing. If you want to enforce a norm, you need to attribute an action, I would say. And that's why one of the threats that we see for years and more emerging as well is electronic warfare and cybersecurity. And when an ASAT direct ascent missile is less complicated to attribute, lines of code, malware, or denial of services activities tend to be much more complicated to attribute. And they tend to involve third countries that did not ask anything, but they are still involved in the process. And this is also this type of discussions that we are having, more at the theoretical level, but this is very much happening in practice. So it needs to be a discussion that we have to have in practice. But at the moment, we are discussing what we call the low-hanging fruits, which are, for instance, the ASAT direct ascent missile. And with regards to the different norms, I will say that what could be positive would be to take into consideration obligations like transparent behaviors, duty to inform, duty to pay due regard, and also putting in place confidence-building measures, public national policies on the space strategy and the space defense. You tell what you do, and you do what you tell, and this type of different approaches. And also, and I'm thinking more about the cyberspace now, and this is also the theme of the conference, it's about capacity building. Because for cyberspace, not all states have the same capacity, not only to use cyberspace, but also to build safety measures, standards, technical norms that all can follow and that all the industry can have in mind when conducting a business so they can ensure a protection. And with these safety norms, they can also improve their security against intentional threats.
Thanks, Laetitia. I think that's great. Just given that paucity of time, let me come to quickly ask about the OEWG itself. 2 sessions have happened. What are the major takeaways? Are there kind of divisions? Is there a cohesion that you see, more of a convergence or divergence within the OEWG in terms of the discussion? Where do you see the discussions going? What are the major takeaways, your impressions on the OEWG 2 sessions that have been held so far? Start off with you, Laetitia.
Okay, thank you. It's a very good question because indeed we see processes that are taking decades. And we sometimes ask ourselves, what is the outcome? What do we want to achieve? First, I would say that amidst international tensions all over the world, it's always extremely positive to see states discussing. And as long as the negotiations are happening and the different actors are represented in the room and willing to take part in the discussion, this is a positive outcome. Also, some states will identify the different perceptions. I would say exactly the same. As long as there are discussions among states and they manage to agree or disagree on topics, but at least put their point on the table and see and show how themselves and others are involved in space activities, this is a very positive outcome. Now, I would say that I had the chance this year to participate in the digital debate also. Perhaps you've seen the ORF journal. I put together kind of a summary of what happened during the OEWG and some different thoughts that could emerge, and I will be very happy to discuss it with some of you if you're interested. But we can see that it's not only major space powers that are taking the floor, it's also groups of smaller space powers that are involved or that are benefiting from space activities and applications, and they have their voice also. So for instance, in September, Cambodia took the floor on behalf of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, so ASEAN, and they reminded that access to outer space is an inalienable right. It's in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. They also called on all the member states, in particular those with major space capabilities, to prevent an arms race in outer space and maintain peace and security. And by this, they showed how involved they are also in taking part in the discussions. There is also a very interesting working paper. It's the working paper number 12 that you can find on the Office on Disarmament Affairs website. If you type on whatever web browser, OEWG space threats, there is a working paper submitted by Philippines, and one co-submitted by Philippines and Germany, which is extremely nice to have, let's say, a European country and a country from the Global South. And it's extremely good quality research, submission, and thoughts on the problem and on the most pressing threats. So I really encourage you to consult this paper. And finally, it's also reminding the application of international law. And this is something that we have to keep in mind. International law, it applies to outer space activities, but also to outer space as an area of activities indeed. So this is how they put an emphasis on responsible behavior.
And then I know we're getting close on time, Raji, so I'll be brief. But I mean, the main thing about the open-ended working group is that it's intended to provide a report that is consensus-driven, which means every single state member that's there has to say, yes, we agree with this. So at the last session, I want to say there were like 50 countries involved in the conversation, and so you can imagine that's a wide breadth of interests. But to be honest, if you're talking about, are there divisions, there are countries like Russia and China that have been pushing their version of a treaty preventing the placement of weapons in outer space, who are they're involved in this conversation, but my interpretation is that they're involved because they want to make sure that perhaps it doesn't go very far. And so there's concern that the countries that don't support the OEWG process may not agree, and there might not be overall consensus in the final report. But that does not mean that there is not a benefit to this process. First of all, we still have 2 more sessions open in working group, so who knows, a lot can go a lot of places. They have one in January and one in August of next year. Hopefully they're going to come up with some sort of final report. But I mean, the whole process, as Laetitia said, I think has been very good in terms of capacity building, raising awareness of a lot of countries and the importance of space security. And I think a lot of countries can take what they learn about what is considered responsible behavior and take it back and incorporate it at the national level. There's nothing stopping them from saying, you know what, we heard about these best practices, they make sense, we're going to do it there. It also doesn't mean that there can't be a plurality of countries agreeing at the open-ended working group and then taking what they see as responsible behavior and using that in the UN, at the UN General Assembly, which you don't need consensus, you can have, a simple majority, that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of benefits and opportunities for a beneficial outcome for the open-ended working group, even if it isn't an official 100% agreement report. But I mean, a lot can change. We have about a year, so we'll see what happens, but cautiously optimistic.
Okay, we have slightly more than 5 minutes. Let's see if we can get a round of questions from the audience and then move to the last round here. So are there questions from the audience? Yeah, let's start with you. Mike. Okay, you can go to just behind you. You can go to the mic there. Yeah, yes, please.
Yeah, hello. My name is Mukund. Thanks to the panel for the amazing discussion. I was wondering if this dialogue on open space can learn from the analogy of what's happening in the climate change space. When the first movers during the industrial era created a lot of carbon emissions, right, and led to the global warming. So can a similar equity be ensured in open space debris, wherein all the countries get equal or an equitable space in open space? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, please go to that one of the mics here, please. And you can go to the other mic and then.
Yeah, I work as an arbitrator, alternate dispute resolution, and we had a request from one client on, outer space dispute resolution. So it's actually a question on timelines. How long do you think it'll take for, us outer space, dispute resolution tribunal to come to some sort of an international, not harmonization, but some sort of an agreement on that, on outer space dispute resolution?
Okay, thank you. I'll take the last question there. Yeah. Yes.
When we're talking about the space risk prevention, are we accommodating the private actors simultaneously who could work on the state interest simultaneously?
Can you please speak into the microphone?
Could you hear me now?
It's better.
Yeah, I have to.
The role on you. Yeah.
So I was talking about that. When we're talking about the space risk prevention, are we accommodating the private actors who could act on behalf of the state interest simultaneously? That's my question.
I can too.
Okay, one final question. Can you just get to the mic quickly and we can wrap it up then?
Yeah, hi, I'm Martin Jhan from JNU. I need to ask one question regarding space. When we talk about space, mostly the academics is about physics and technology. From the prism of international relations and security, not much, in terms of course curriculum has not been developed in countries especially like India. How do you see the future of the academia vis-a-vis, making courses on space governance, etc.?
Okay, that's more of an academic question that we can, anyway. Back to the panelists. Victoria, start off.
I'll do really quickly. In regards to the question about what the role of the private sector, obviously the private sector has a huge role to play in terms of establishing just standard operating procedure and best practices. Right now, there's about 7,000 active satellites in orbit. Of those, about 3,200 belong to one entity, and that's not a country actor. It is SpaceX, their Starlink satellite. And so obviously they have a huge emphasis and a huge way in which to affect the stability and security of the regime. But having said that, in the grand scheme of things, the Outer Space Treaty, which is the overarching treaty for space law, that everyone follows, it has an article called Article 6, where it says nations are responsible for the activities of their nationals in space. So in the end, countries are responsible for whatever actions companies do, even if they weren't the ones involved in that. And so I think that's where you get the balance from security and safety. But obviously, I think there is a role for the private sector. It's just tough as well because a lot of these discussions at the international level are held at the United Nations, which is obviously not private actors, it's national actors. So yeah, with that, move to the next question.
Thank you. Okay, so I will merge the two first questions with the knowledge I have, so I hope I will answer it thoroughly, as much as I can. So with the first one with regards to space debris, and the second one about the time it takes also, we have to keep in mind that at the space level, there are two different international committees, conference that are in charge of the different topics. So the Conference on Disarmament is focusing on space security, all of the intentional threats, all of the disruption that are caused, not accidentally, when the COPUOS, which is the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, it's also, let's say, UN body, but it's with other diplomats focusing on safety questions, civilian scientific questions. And at the Conference on Disarmament level, especially during the discussions at the OEWG, a lot of states consider that there is a strict delimitation between the attribution of the Conference on Disarmament and those of the COPUOS. In my opinion, we should create some bridges, because space debris are created by direct ascent ASAT missile test, for instance. So space debris is not only a space safety issue. Now, with regards to the time of the negotiation, it depends, and I'm very happy to see that there are other lawyers in the room, because everything depends. And that's why, courses for space lawyers and all of the different initiatives that we can have to train current professionals, but also students, young professionals, future lawyers, I think it's fundamental. And there are, of course, some organizations like the International Institute of Space Law that are trying to, get some traction to bring new law people, but also political scientists, people specializing in international relations to the discussion, because we need brain to discuss and to reduce the duration of the negotiation process. And we need brains from all of the different countries, not only from the traditional, what we call the space powers. And finally, with regards to the private actors' involvement, and it goes hand to hand with what I just said, at the OEWG, I will repeat, it's open-ended. So if you are representing an academia, a university, a think tank, an organization, or a company, you can submit a request to participate in the discussion and eventually submit a written submission. And this is also something that will be consulted by the different states, and this is something that you can, use to be a part of the discussion. So don't hesitate to come and chat with us if you're interested in this. It's really an opportunity to make your voice count in the international discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Laetitia and Victoria. So you can come up with a number of different ways to deal with these things, whether you can come up with the technical measures to deal with the challenges that we talked about, whether it is ASAT testing or the space debris and so on and so forth, or you can even come up with legal measures. But at the end of the day, I think the biggest challenge that I see is the political concerns. The development of political concerns, getting the states to agree upon a course of action. First to start with, agree upon the kind of challenges, then to kind of agree on the kind of measures that we need to deal with these challenges. I think that political part is the biggest problem, and I think OEWG has been a more comprehensive measure so far, effort so far, and hopefully we have another 2 more sessions to go. Maybe it will lead to something more meaningful than the previous efforts. So on that note, let me thank the 2 panelists, and we break here. Thank you.